third and last, but then he will reincarnate as the phoenix, like Coventry University phoenix. Because the university, in his wisdom, I don't know, possibly Madeline as a legacy, our new old Vice Chancellor, has decided to restructure the whole area of research, which means that ARGs are all being reconfigured, let's call it that way. So I wish I'd known that before I took the last 2 weeks organising this.
No, this is still very well worth doing.
Okay.
And,
right.
You know,
yes.
Just carry on as though it hasn't been decided.
Okay.
We want it up on the department website as well.
And
as
can I just
website.
say, as part of the PR, we also value having students on board, and we have students who win national prizes and nominated for national prizes. And this is Ray, who actually won the Course Tutors Award last year because he was the best student on the course, and now he's also been nominated as a finalist in the national competition for poetry and short stories. So this is fantastic. And nice to see two students here. I'm really pleased. Okay, over to wonderful Lyndsey, who will mesmerise us and get us warmed up for tomorrow for Shakespeare. So, excellent. Right.
Thank you all for coming. I was just saying to Marina that I gave a paper a couple of weeks ago at the dance research group over in art and design, and I think there were 5 people there to start with, 3 people left halfway through. Don't know what happened, and yeah, so I'm used to small, intimate forums, that's fine. Okay, so today I'm going to talk about something that I haven't done an awful lot of, but that I'd like to develop further, and that is teaching Shakespeare outdoors. And we do actually have a couple of students who were involved in the one event that I did teach outdoors, so it'd be interesting to hear their views. First of all, a couple of ideas to conjure with, really. This paper will be about the principles of teaching outdoors. Obviously, when you're teaching literature outdoors, issues of environmentalism, green issues come up quite strongly. And while I'm all in favour of perhaps increasing the environmental awareness of our students, I think there are a couple of areas we need to be aware of. One is our own complicitness in environmental damage as consumers of literature, consumers of culture. As Jonathan Bates says, the price of art is the destruction of a living tree. You create culture by enslaving nature. So we can't absolve ourselves from that issue in any way. The other area that I'm very careful about is the notion of environmentalism being a rather conservative philosophy. Simon Sharma talks about this in rather real terms, this being England, the Greenwood generally votes Conservative, but I think there's also something inherently conservative about environmentalism and the desire to turn back the clock in some way. So that's also not what I'm trying to do here. I think when you're teaching something green or eco using literature, especially old books, you want to be very careful to encourage students not to think about the grass being greener 5 centuries ago, but about actually Shakespeare and other authors being just as interested in the human impact on the environment as we are today. That human impact is not a feature of global modernity, it's actually a feature of humanity. So they're just 2 caveats for you to think about while I discuss what we did back in May. So the plan for this paper is to tell you what I did, why on earth I did it, and where next. These are my foresters, 2 of which are here today, Dan and Hayley. Very select group, as we are today, of second-year students, and as you can see, they're somewhere foresty. But I will describe what we did in more detail. But I'm incredibly grateful to this group of students. So, last academic year, 8 second-year students who were on my module Shakespeare Today volunteered for an optional forest school trip. So this wasn't mandatory, it wasn't part of the assessment of the module or anything like that. It was something completely optional, and of course the keenest, brightest students applied to do it. The trip was held in May this year, and it's forest school light, really. I'll explain what forest school is in a couple of minutes, but it was a rather sanitised version of what forest school could be. We went to Anne Hathaway's cottage in Stratford, and we used the surrounding woodland around the cottage to work in. And if you've never been to Anne Hathaway's cottage, this is how bucolic it is. I think that's even in fuzzy focus, just to make it a little bit more. This is the real thing. It's not one of those ornaments you have on your mantelpiece. It's real. Now, the reason that I did this, because I'm not an educational researcher, I was undertaking my PG certificate in higher education and professional practice, and part of the assessment for that course is a new to you teaching innovation. So they make you do something new. You have to include within some of your teaching a technique, a pedagogical practice that you've never ever tried before. And it was quite interesting because we had a day of training during the PG Cert where speakers came in to inspire us to think of something new that we could do for this innovation. And all of the speakers were involved in digital innovation of some kind, which is obviously incredibly current and popular. And I sat there, and there were these incredible people from art and design who came in. I don't know if you know Jonathan Shaw and Jonathan Worth, who have, even before MOOCs had taken over the planet, had their own free and open undergraduate photography class online, and it's been incredibly popular. And this was all very inspiring, but I'm not particularly technologically savvy. I didn't really know what to do, and it kind of irritated me as well that it was all digital. So just to be obtuse really, I thought I was sitting there thinking of the most low-tech, anti-digital thing that I could do, just to shift the ground on which we were walking at that point. And that's when I came up with the idea of actually nothing particularly technical about this, just taking students out of the classroom, taking them somewhere outside and seeing how learning works or differs in that environment. So that's what I did. It culminated in a poster presentation for the PG Cert, and I won the poster prize for creativity and innovation, so I was very pleased with that. This is that poster. It doesn't really look like anyone else's poster. Maybe that's why I won it. But it's not particularly legible here, but this is the data material from the survey I took of the students, and they're tree rings. So if you saw the poster, you'd probably be able to work it out a bit better. But more important than that was that we had a really, really brilliant day, I think. Did we have a brilliant day? Yes. You've got to say yes, haven't you? And the day consisted of these different elements. One was a mini lecture, obviously given outside. I'd set some reading before the day. I'm not sure that all students read the article, but some did. It was actually this article by Lyndsey, Shakespeare's Globe and England's Wood. And I started talking about the way in which we can interpret text using an eco-critical perspective. And I suppose what I wanted to instill was complexity, that it's not just about looking for nature language within Shakespeare. That's too simplistic. It's about looking for the complications of Shakespeare's relationship to nature and his continuing relationship to nature even though he's long dead. So for example, the play that we were studying last semester was As You Like It, which is set in the Forest of Arden. So we were out there in the woodlands around Stratford looking for the remnants of the Forest of Arden. But of course in Shakespeare, it's also the Forest of Ardennes. Is it England? Is it France? Actually, it's neither. It's in a playhouse in London. What do these complicating factors do to our interpretation? How do they inflect our reading of the plays? And Lyndsey makes a lovely point about this. He says, Shakespeare routinely conscripted the woodenness of the playhouse to perform the role of tree, woods, forest, orchard and park. So what he's talking about there is the very, very bare stage of Shakespearean theatre. They would have had props, they may have even had a tree prop, painted tree. But generally speaking, if you're performing in a wooden theatre, a framed theatre, the wooden O of the globe, you can actually use that wooden frame to depict the forest. And that has some really interesting connotations in terms of the relationship between the inside and the outside, between the city and the country, when you're using the kind of reclaimed wood of a forest built as a theatre to perform your play. So it's not just about nature language. It's about a whole world of theatrical imagination. So that was a quick mini lecture. We then had an orientation exercise, which I think the students rather enjoyed. They were asked to run around, find willow, either a willow tree, willow sculptures in the garden of Anne Hathaway's cottage, and consider the relationship between love and the natural world. So they ran about quite happily while I had a coffee in the tea room. And this is a quote, this is a passage from Twelfth Night, Shakespeare's Twelfth Night, where Viola talks about how she would express her love for someone. And she says that she would express it by building a willow cabin outside their house, remaining there in the cold, in the outdoors, and writing loyal cantons of condemned love and sing them loud even in the dead of night. And there's a sense here of using the willow as a symbol of forsaken love, which was very common in the period. So in Shakespeare's Othello, Desdemona sings a willow song just before she's murdered by her husband, and also poor Ophelia falls out of a willow tree to her watery death. So there's a sense of willow used as a symbol of both love but also tragedy. And so the students found these examples of willow sculptures that have been built for rather romantic functioning, and thought about that relationship of those and willow trees to the play itself. Here's an example of Mariam caught in a willow structure and thinking about the repercussions of that. We left her there, she's still there. The next thing we did on the day was a thematic exercise. It wasn't completely outdoorsy, our trip to Anne Hathaway's cottage. We actually went into the cottage, had a tour of the building, and then we had an outdoor discussion, it was raining, of the dynamic within Shakespeare's text between interior and exterior spaces. And I think one of the sad things about the day is that we filmed a lot of the student discussion, and then my partner wiped it from his camera, which was a real shame, because I think in this discussion the students started to make real connections and think about, in a very historicist way, how a 16th, 17th century person would think about the outdoor world, would think about indoor, outdoor when there's no electricity, would think about outdoor experience and the colour of outdoor experience when the interiors are so dark and so gloomy. So we made some really interesting connections, I think. Sheltering from the rain. Willow is useful in some cases. We also had a student-centred exercise, which was really, it was a bit of fun. Students were given disposable cameras, asked to capture a series of Shakespearean nature quotations from the woodland surroundings and consider their own response to the green space. So we've got a whole series of photographs that in some way match quotations from the play. I've got a couple of examples here, both from As You Like It. Sorry, Hayley. Sorry. This is Mariam and Hayley channeling, I hope, under the greenwood tree, who loves to lie with me. Was that the quote you were going for? Possibly. That's my guess. And here's Amy, who's not here today, channeling another quote from the play, which is, "Let the forest judge. Let the forest judge me." Okay, there were various learning outcomes, because I had to treat this like a proper educational exercise, so we've got learning outcomes. I wanted students to demonstrate an understanding of the significance of nature within Shakespeare's writing. And to be honest, I think if you compare this environment as a forum for discussing nature and the environment we were in as a forum for discussing nature, I think it can only enhance that learning. I mean, I really do. I think you make connections, you just feel more in tune with that kind of writing if you're there. I also wanted them to develop not just an intellectual response to the text, but an emotional, nuanced and effective response to the text. And I think that again is assisted by being outdoors and performing those words, performing those plays in the outdoors. And it's not just namby-pamby. Effect theory cognitive responses, emotional responses to texts are very current as a way of looking at literature as well. I also wanted them to acquire an increased sense of the environmental concerns and those that are shared by both the early moderns and ourselves. So the essay by Vin Nardisi that I mentioned at the beginning of the paper, talking about this theatre built out of wood, built out of forest wood, also goes on to talk about deforestation within the period, how concerning that was to the early moderns. So again, it's about reflecting on global damage not just as a feature of our own society, but a feature of a much, much older society. And from a critical perspective, I'd like them to demonstrate an awareness of eco-criticism as a theoretical frame for discussions of nature writing. So eco-criticism is not currently a literary theory we teach necessarily here at Coventry, but it's certainly very current. It's actually quite established over the last few years. And looking at literature through that frame of the environment is useful because it's another theory that students can grapple with, but it's also pertinent, you know, from a societal point of view. And I think sometimes in literature we're accused of not particularly being that pertinent from a societal point of view. So was it successful? Well, I've got the students' response. All age students were surveyed, 100% responded, and of course, with such a small group, such a small keen group, I was kind of expecting positive feedback, to be honest, but I think it's still useful. 100% of students found Forest School to be of educational value, 100% felt it enhanced their understanding of nature writing within Shakespeare, and perhaps more interestingly, 75% recommend an expansion of Forest School techniques across the BA English programme. So not 100% there, but maybe something to go on. So let me tell you a bit about Forest School as an initiative, because it's not something I made up, obviously, and I've got some books here in case anyone's interested. It's an innovative pedagogical approach in which learning takes place in an outdoor environment, preferably a woodland setting, but not necessarily. Now, its roots in the UK lie in a visit by the early years department of Bridgewater College in Somerset to Denmark in 1994. And I don't know if you know this, but Scandinavia has a long-standing history of outdoor learning. They're much more adept, despite the cold, much more adept at taking children and teenagers out into the countryside. Now, the defining characteristics of Forest School in the UK, and we are talking here about mainly a primary school initiative that's kind of moved into secondary schools now, but certainly hasn't entered the HE sector in any real sense, I don't think. But the defining characteristics of Forest School include, obviously, the woodland environment, a safe space in which the trust established between educator and learner is pivotal, which is understandable when you're off campus, as it were. And of course, the Scandinavian dictum, there's no such thing as bad weather, only bad clothing. That's really important. Learner-led activities, so that's something to work on, really getting the students involved. And demarcated beginnings and ends to sessions. So, for example, completing a session with a campfire and a celebration. So Forest School within primary education is much more well established, and it's much riskier in the sense that they do tree climbing, fire making, and they have all sorts of outdoor activities, whereas we were sort of almost transposing the classroom environment into the country. But I think if I were to take this forward, I'd like to incorporate more of those elements. And we'll talk a bit about this in a minute. So the celebration is really important. We did have a celebration, well, we had lunch. I'm calling that the celebration. It was outside, of course. So what's the rationale, at least within primary, secondary education, for Forest School and taking children outdoors? This is a committee from the House of Commons in 2010, and really discussing the extent to which children are denied access to the countryside. So only half of 6 to 15-year-olds go on a trip to the countryside with their school. That's from a survey from the Countryside Alliance. The likelihood of a child visiting any green space is halved in a generation. Nearly 2/3 of children played at home indoors more than any other place. So you can see that there's an issue, at least within compulsory education with children getting out to the countryside. And this is what it seems to be the benefits of forest school, at least by the government, who try to encourage this as much as they can. The known benefits for pupils of learning outside the classroom are many and varied. They include improved engagement and attendance, the development of learning and thinking skills, and the strengthening of personal, social and emotional development. For example, confidence, self-reliance and management of risk. So I suppose the question for me, trying to take forest school into higher education, is does this apply? And I think a lot of the material on social development, personal development, although that would be a fantastic side effect, is not as appropriate to us as it is to compulsory education. One of the issues I have with a lot of the material on this is that it's not very specific about what's learned in the outdoor environment. It's just thought that people will be happier, children will be happier and more conducive to learning in the outdoors. So this is quite a good example of this. This is a manifesto that was published in 2006 by the Department of Education and Skills. So they say learning outside the classroom is about raising achievement through an organised, powerful approach to learning in which direct experience is of prime importance. This is not about what we learn, but importantly how and where we learn. Now, while I accept that how and where we learn is important, I'm really interested in the what. I think the what is crucial to this. And I think there's more that can be done about the specifics of what is learned better, more effectively in the outdoors environment. And I think I'm assisted here by a slight change in literary studies as well. What you might call a spatial term. So in the last decade or so, there have been a huge proliferation of literary approaches that consider eco, ideas, geography, spatiality generally. So it's been hugely influential within the academy, and these are just a few of the disciplines that have emerged through this spatial term. So literary geography, literary cartography, geophilosophy, geopoetics, geocriticism, eco-criticism, which is probably the most famous, and spatial humanities. So they're all variations on a theme in which literature is viewed through that prism of the environment, of the world, and the outdoors. And the emergence of this spatial criticism has also encouraged a lot of inter- and transdisciplinary practices, with, among other subjects, geography, and of course within geography, the development of psychogeography has really influenced this here. Architecture, archaeology, history, and urban studies. So it's happening, that spatial turn seems to be happening in a lot of different areas within the academy. So there's a lot of potential for collaboration. This is a quote by Lynn Bruckner, she's an American academic, who also likes to teach Shakespeare outside. The ecotone is just a word for the kind of boundary between two environments, so perhaps between the city and the country, or the forest and the clearing. But she talks about how this is Shakespeare in the ecotone, letting the archival and the presentist collide, even compete to achieve something that matters. So, I won't go into this too much, but there's sort of a debate within eco-criticism in literature between whether it's something that's about the past, looking at the past texts to sort of elicit any environmental concerns, or whether it's really about the present, presentism is about whether we can ever read a literary text without bringing some of our own present feelings, thoughts, concerns into that reading, and of course we can't. So there is that debate within eco-criticism. And that's something to work with. But I think somehow there's a possibility of resolving that debate within outdoor learning. I want to think about, quickly before we finish, about what the limits of this are. Whether literature benefits from being taught outside in a way that other subjects doesn't or don't. Whether you have to really push the natural eco aspect of literature when you're teaching outside. And I think this report by the Forestry Commission in 2002 is quite interesting, even though it's about children. It says access to green space is not just about the environment. for young children there is perceived to be great benefit in teaching most subjects in a natural environment. So actually it's not about the subject matter, it's not about fitting the literature to match the space, that there is just a benefit to being outdoors and learning outdoors, or at least taking children or students out of this environment and doing something outdoors. So I think that's quite interesting. And this is another argument for that really. Peter Higgins, who's written a lot about outdoor learning, says the fact that not all schooling employs experiential approaches should stimulate us to ask if there are limits to what we can know experientially. So I've already said that experiential learning is limited in the sense that it's very much about the how and the where rather than what. But I think this is a really pertinent question in thinking about, is there anything we can't teach outside? In some way, in some small way. So what to do now? For me personally, I'd like to organise further trips. I'd like to put in a bid for internal funding, and I've discussed that already with Paul Casher. Next year when the call comes out, I'd like to apply for a Higher Education Academy grant, and perhaps from one of these two pots of funding, if I'm successful, think about getting some genuine forest school training of the kind that teaches you how to make campfires and do all of that stuff. Of course, if we were to expand this, there would be more students, there would need to be more staff. So it would be interesting to see if anyone was interested in joining that. And just as a joke really, the expansion of forest school principles, I'm part of a GISC network called the Walking Network, which is all about a real burgeoning area of research to do with walking. So whether it's performance art, which is done outside in walking, or other kinds of criticism or research. And one of the things that's come out of that, and which has become really popular in America and in Europe as a business innovation, is walking meetings. So I would have shown you a TED talk if I had time, but the idea is that instead of having a meeting here, in a room or an office, you actually get up, you go outside, maybe not a departmental meeting, there are probably too many people involved in that, but maybe for a one-on-one meeting, you actually get outside and walk, it frees your mind, gets you out of the room, we're sitting on our bums most of the day, so I would like to put that into the mix as well. But the message really is that I had an awesome time on that day, it was great, and I'd like to be outdoors more. So if I can do it whilst teaching, I'll be very, very happy indeed. So thank you.
That was fascinating. I was going to suggest the Teaching Innovation Grant, but you got there before I could suggest it. I'm actually, I mean, it's a bit essential because I'm part of the people who allocates the grant. So I've just allocated one to Tiziana and Billy this morning. So, you know, I have a little influence there if you apply. Anyway, we'll not record that. Thanks, Phil.
I was going to say, is the camera off now?
Now,